Um, I think we should get started. It's 11:02 by my Apple Watch, and I know we've got people from multiple time zones, so respecting everybody's time. So good morning. My name is Adam Blackwell, the Vice President International at Development Services Group. On behalf of the team at Global Terrorism Trends and Analysis Center, that are known as GTTAC, I will be moderating this session. For those of you who don't know us, GTTAC was created by Development Services Group and our partners at GMU, TRAC, the Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center, led by Dr. Louise Shelley, to support our efforts on the contract we have with the Department of State to develop a database of global terrorism incidents, to prepare the annual annex of statistical information on terrorism, and to help prepare and edit the congressionally mandated country reports on terrorism. We do this with a combination of technology, massive data collection, and a team of well-trained, multilingual and multicultural data analysts, most of whom are at George Mason University, many students, many who are studying terrorism and international security, and hopefully are listening and learning in today. This is our first and what we hope will become a series of talks by eminent people in the field of terrorism. If you or anyone listening would like to present in a future talk, please let me know via the chat function in Zoom. We're delighted to kick off our first session with a very eminent colleague, friend, Dr. Arie Perliger, who is the professor and director of the graduate program in security studies at the School of Criminology and Justice Studies at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. I hope I got that right, Arie. Arie has for more than 2 decades engaged in an extensive study of issues related to terrorism and political violence and security policy and politics, the politics and extremism of the far right in Israel, Europe, the US, the Middle Eastern politics, and the applicability of social network analysis to the study of political violence. His studies appear in 9 books and monographs and in numerous articles and book chapters, and were cited by more than 1,300 academic texts. His recent book, and I unfortunately don't have it here with me, an excellent book called American Zealots. I have read it. This was published by Columbia University Press in 2019, I believe, Arie. So it's relatively recent, and it provides an in-depth analysis of the history and contemporary trends of the violent American far right. Dr. Perliger has also engaged in training practitioners from various agencies such as the FBI, CIA, and ICE. Additionally, he provided professional briefings to high-ranked officials from the government and the military, such as the Secretary of the Army Chief of Staff, and SOCOM, AFRICOM, NORTHCOM, and JSOC commanders. Dr. Perliger is also engaged in informing the public via contributions to various media platforms. His articles appeared, among others, in the New York Times, the BBC, C-SPAN, NPR, and Newsweek. As some of you may have heard us chit-chatting a bit at the beginning, Dr. Perliger will speak for 20 minutes, and then we will moderate a Q&A using the Q&A function in Zoom, which is usually on the bottom panel of your screen. So without any further ado, Arie, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Adam, and hi, everyone. Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be with you, so thank you for the invitation, and also thank you, Adam, for your kind introduction. So what I'll try to do for the next 20 minutes is really give you some insights that appeared in the book that was published actually in 2020. On various aspects of the violent American far right. So the first part of the book is really strive to provide a broad conceptual and historical overview of the American far right, and especially its violent components. And it was really important for me to highlight the different ideological branches of the American far right. I think one of the main problems that we're facing is that we tend to look at the American far right as some kind of a uniform entity, but the fact is that various components of that movement have different ideological tendencies, different ideological focus. And this is also important because ideological differences are translated in many cases to also distinct organizational structures and modus operandi. So it's also important to understand the differences between the various components of the American far-right, because it has a wider implications that eventually also impact how we shape our policy response to these groups. I also was trying to provide some more historical proficiency to people who wants to know more about the American far-right, and I was trying to highlight some historical episodes that many people may not be familiar with, such as, for example, the Know Nothing Party, which was basically the first anti-immigration movement in the United States, and was very active and very successful, actually, in the 1850s. The second part of the book, which is the most significant part of it, is relying on a very comprehensive database that I collected with my team, and includes more than 5,000 incidents of violent attacks perpetrated by members of various far-right groups or by people who are trying to promote far-right ideology. And by analyzing these databases and by looking at trends over time, we were able to come up with some really interesting insights about the landscape of the far-right. So, for example, when we're looking at different trends over time in the level of violence, the scope of the violence, one of the things that we see very clearly is that as we're getting close to presidential elections, we see a rise in the level of violence. This is something that we see consistently for the last 30 years. There's actually one elections where we haven't seen this kind of trend, and this is the 1996 elections between Clinton and Dole. And probably that is because these were probably one of the least competitive elections in American history. It was very clear almost from the beginning that it will be a fairly easy victory for the Democratic candidate. But except for that specific outlier, we actually see consistently that starting in the primary year, moving to the election year, we see a rise in the level of violence. And there are several explanations for that. First of all, I think individuals are more receptive to political messages during election times. The political environment is much more toxic and more contentious and more competitive. And this is something which has an important meaning, since we also see an increasing polarization of American society and of the political system, which means that electoral processes are being perceived really as a zero-sum game. And if it's a zero-sum game, then there's more willingness to engage in more extreme political activities in order to ensure your victory. Another reason why we may see more violence as we're getting closer to election year is because that many parts of the far-right, this is exactly the time where they actually facing the fact that they have eventually very limited influence on the political process. Despite multiple attempts by far-right leaders to be elected to various public offices, for the most part, they were unsuccessful. And this kind of inability to really influence the political process probably leads some of them to engage in illegal and violent activities. An interesting trend, however, that we've seen after the last elections in 2016 is the fact that the violence didn't decline after the elections. Usually, after the elections, we see somewhat of a decline in the following couple of years until we see a rise again as we're getting closer to another elections. And when we're trying to understand why we haven't seen a decline in the level of violence after the 2016 elections, it can be attributed to several factors. For example, the perceptions that the government and law enforcement are more tolerant toward this kind of violent activism, but mainly probably because the members of these far-right groups feel more empowered now. They feel that they have more influence, more legitimacy, especially as more elements of their rhetoric, of their agenda, are getting visibility and getting more attention in the mainstream political discourse. And this is something that I'll talk about later on, but definitely we see much more terms and much more ideas that 10 years ago populated mainly the fringe elements of the far right, really now penetrating the mainstream political discourse. So this is as for the changes in terms of the number and volume of attacks over time. Another interesting thing that we find is the fact that the geographical distribution of far-right violence, and here I'm talking about all types of violence, including hate crime, domestic terrorism, attacks against property, and so on. The violence is mainly concentrated in what we usually define as blue state, more progressive states, so such as Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, California, Washington State, New York, and so on. In contrast to what we find in the Deep South. Actually, most of the Deep South states, such as Mississippi, Missouri, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, actually experience much lower levels of far-right violence. And there's several explanations for that. I'll start by the fact that the states where we see the highest level of violence are the states that are going the highest level of diversification. These are states which experience dramatic demographic diversification in the last decade or so, which means also that we see this kind of changes in their population, which create much more tensions and much more breeding ground for contentious environment that leads to these kind of violent activities. Another reason is the fact that most of the violence in these states is not happening in the big metropolitan areas, but actually in the suburbs or the half suburb, half rural areas. And what happened is that when these states started to experience demographic diversification, most of it happened in the main metropolitan areas, New York City, think about Boston, think about Philadelphia, and so on. However, throughout the years, as more and more minority members experience upwards economic mobilization, they move to the suburbs and eventually to more rural areas. So basically what we, as the most of the violence that we see is actually some kind of a backlash of individuals from these suburban areas or half rural, half suburb areas that feel that their communities are changing demographically, ethnically. They feel that the nature and the culture and various aspects of their community is changing, and that makes them more vulnerable for recruitment by far-right groups and more suspected to be influenced by far-right ideology. The most significant predictors of far-right violence on the state level is actually the increased rate in Hispanic and Asian American population. And we think that the main reason for that these are the groups that represent the most significant threat in terms of competition over competition in the job market, in the labor market, as well as in other economic sectors. And but this is definitely something that we need actually to dive more into and to really to understand what are the specific dynamics. But it's important to understand that this also confirmed the fact that diversification is a significant factor that leads to violence, which means that that policymakers, practitioners, political leaders need to think how we can develop a better mechanism to ensure a much more effective integration of minorities in previously homogeneous communities, and how we can really ensure that the diversification doesn't lead necessarily to violence. Because I think most of us agree that diversification is a good thing. We want to encourage that, but we need also to think how we can also develop some policy mechanism that ensure that it doesn't lead to more violence and so on. I would like also to mention that we also see some changes lately in the target selection of far-right groups. So, for example, for many years we've seen that there's a very clear association between the ideological affinity of the group and its target selection, which means that militia groups, for example, had a tendency to attack mainly government facilities or government proxies, federal agents, and so on. While naturally, pro-life violent groups tend to attack abortion clinics or physicians and so on. But if we go beyond these fairly trivial insights, we can also see that there's some interesting dynamics that I'm not sure that we are capable to explain them as effectively as we would like to. So for example, we see a very clear rise in the number of attacks against religious sites. And this is maybe related to the increased anti-religious or Islamophobic rhetoric that we see among many of the far-right groups. That may be also another impact of increasing Islamophobia. But I believe that I think one of the reasons is that I think more and more far-right leaders and perpetrators understand the unique impact of such an attack on a minority community or on a religious community. By attacking a synagogue or a mosque or any other kind of temple, you don't just ensure that you attack a very specific group of people, but you also attack their ability to maintain their community, to maintain this sense of solidarity, this sense of cohesion. Because for most of these communities, the religious site is not just a place where they are worshiping their God, but it's also a place where they conduct most of their community events. It's a place where they conduct many educational events, many cultural events. It's really the hub, the center of the community. So attacking that center really send a very strong message to that community and helps to intensify the psychological impact of these kind of attacks and really create this kind of, and help the perpetrators to amplify this sense of terror, of concerns, of fear among these communities. And I think that when we're looking at the rhetoric and we're looking at the discourse of far-right groups, we see that they understand this advantages that are embedded in the practice of attacking religious sites. We also see some interesting spikes and declines in attacks against LGBTQ targets. So for example, we see between 1998 and 2002 and between 2009 and 2013, we see a dramatic rise in the number of attacks against LGBTQ targets. The one between 2009 and 2013, these were the high days of the struggle for the approval of, or the promotion of the legal approval of gay marriage and other LGBT related issues. So maybe that's something that created a backlash that intensified the violence. But the fact is that we don't really have really good explanations why these are the timeframes when we see a spike in attacks against LGBTQ communities. Nonetheless, it's still important to mention that the number of attacks against these targets is still fairly high when you compare them to what we've seen in the 90s and so on. And lastly, if I'm still focusing on operational characteristics of far-right violence in the US, is that still, despite all the concerns that we have, despite all the warnings that we give, for the most part, most of the attacks are not overly sophisticated. Definitely, they are not on par with what we see among, for example, Islamic terrorist organizations or nationalist organizations. There are some, outliers. We all are familiar with, some of the recent attacks and with the Oklahoma City bombing. But overall, it's still lagging in terms of level of sophistication. A little bit about the individuals who are actually perpetrating many of these attacks. Probably the most, one of the most important insight that I provide in the book is an analysis and differentiation between what I call spontaneous attacks or spontaneous perpetrators, and those who are perpetrating attacks which are pre-planned, plotted usually some time before the actual attack, and in many cases are more a manifestation of a group work, of a collective work, rather than just one individual's engaging in his own attack. I don't want to go too deep into all the differences, but there are differences between these two types of perpetrators. For example, spontaneous perpetrators are usually, for example, we found that they're usually less educated, are coming from a less affluent background, and usually operate more in affluent areas, in more established area, more homogeneous areas. And I can talk about why this is the case, but I think mainly these are individuals that usually operating in areas where there's not a lot of options in terms of joining an actual established local chapter of the far-right group, where there is some kind of a local neo-Nazi organizational chapter, or the local KKK chapter. They also, for the most part, don't have a lot of opportunities to express their views as a result of that in the offline world. And when they get into situations that seems to them as contradicting their ideological views, political views, in some cases they are being triggered, and then we see the slide into a violent incident. Overall, what we also see is some changes in the demographics of many of these groups. So I'm not sure how many of you know, but the far right is extremely masculine in terms of its culture, in terms of its practices and norms. But we do see some changes. We do see that more and more groups are trying to be more inclusive in the sense that they're trying to also recruit female members, and are also open to different types of membership. Again, we need to wait and see if this is will be a consistent trend, but we do see that more and more groups and this feel that it will be beneficial for them to be more inclusive. So, for example, even some of the KK groups that traditionally, for example, refuse to recruit Catholics are now open to Catholics, and some of them even are open to women. Again, something that in the past it was not even something that they were willing to consider. And I'd like to complete my talk with some quick discussion about the discourse of the far-right groups and their rhetoric. One of the interesting things that we see is that many of them really trying to expand their ideological framework and into more mainstream issues. So if you look at some of the mission statements of some of the more influential neo-Nazi organizations and some of the skinheads organizations, you see that they're focusing not just on the conventional issues that they're focusing on, such as their opposition to immigration and their, arguments related to the oppression of white people, etc., and so on. But they're also focusing on issues of some economic issues, for example, focusing on, for example, some of them presenting themselves as the protectors of small businesses. Some of them also are talking more generally about the need to protect the Second Amendment. And so this is a trend that we definitely see among some of the groups. They try to be appealing to a larger constituency, and they believe that they can do that by addressing also issues that were never really part of the core ideological framework of the American far right. Many of them also tend to use very ambiguous, contradictory, obscure language, again, part of their long-term attempt to portray themselves as more as a mainstream organization and to mobilize support also from groups that they usually were unable to get support from in the past. So you'll see a lot of rhetoric about economic patriotism, about ecopolitics, about isolationist foreign policy, something that they actually talk a lot about when you're looking into their message boards and forums and so on. We also see a growing violent rhetoric against various far left groups. Many of these groups, when they discuss, for example, Antifa or other left-wing groups, they really try to portray them as a substantial security threat, as something which is extremely threatening, something that will lead to violations of constitutional rights of white people and so on. So they are trying to, again, to piggyback on this narrative and to try to demonize as much as they can rival political groups. We also see, and this is another important element that we see, is a growing use of male supremacist rhetoric. That means that they understand that male supremacist rhetoric can be very beneficial for them for recruiting, especially young male. So we see a growing usage of these kind of ideas, and some of the leaders in their communication actually explain why they are intentionally doing that. It's not sometimes something which is accidental. It's actually an intentional element that they're trying to integrate into their rhetoric. I can talk a lot more about the various things that we've seen. I'll just end by that some of them are still believe that probably the best solution is some kind of separation. So we still see a lot of language talks, for example, about the creation of some kind of a white autonomic entity, something along the lines of what the Aryan nations have tried to do in Idaho, creating some kind of a separate political entity that will, in their eyes, naturally, will help them to promote the interest of the Aryan race, the white race, and so on. So hopefully that was helpful for you in order to understand what are the main issues that I discuss in the chapter and in my recent research. And I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Arie. That was very interesting. I should have mentioned at the outset that you were recently quoted, I believe it was by the Washington Post, in reference to the Proud Boys and on their mention in the last presidential debate. I am, Louise, I'm not sure whether you can unmute yourself and you want to say something. I believe you're as a panelist here, so. Yes,
no, well, no, I'm unmuted now, I think. Can you hear me?
We can. Yeah.
Great. I thought I'm Louise Shelley. I direct TRAC, where the data analysts are based. And I really enjoyed your presentation. I was thinking back to the late Ehud Sprinzak, who wrote on right-wing terrorism in Israel and how much I learned from him. And I felt the same way listening to your presentation. What do you see different trajectories for this terrorism and right-wing extremism if Biden and Kamala Harris, as a Black woman, win the next election? Or let me just ask you of how you see the trajectories in light of the political environment and the coming elections.
So, first of all, thank you for your question. And I think one of the main characteristics that really differentiate the current election from previous election is the fact that there is a significant mainstream political leaders who are trying to legitimize the electoral process and to legitimize the future election results. And despite all the extremist views of many of these groups, in the past, we haven't seen them try really to challenge the legitimacy of electoral processes or the legitimacy of elections. They naturally, in many cases, they didn't like the election results, but they never really believed that the democratic process is corrupted or is biased or one of those things. And what happens right now when mainstream prominent leaders on the right are basically are doubting the legitimacy of the process, are basically arguing that the results may not be legitimate, may not really reflect the will of the American people. That is something which is very dangerous and can lead to a dramatic spike in the level of violence if indeed Biden and Harris ticket will win the elections. Because for them, for many of these groups, the way they perceive it, that basically is another incident in which this kind of agents within the governments, which are not American patriots, are not, in their eyes, of course, are basically violating or manipulating the democratic process, the electoral process. And just to step back a sec, it's important to remember that for many years and still today, one of the most enduring narratives of the American far right is the idea that the government is being controlled by some kind of a cabal of domestic and foreign agents that are trying to promote some kind of a globalist, universal ideas that are trying to undermine American values and the American way of life, et cetera, et cetera. And for them, basically, this kind of rhetoric that we hear today will lead them to assume that what we've seen in the election is basically another incident where basically the American people's rights and political preferences are not getting real representation and are not really reflected in the election results. And it's the way to justifying violence and illegal activities against the government, against political figures, and against minorities in general will gain more legitimacy, more justification, and will lead probably to increase in the level of violence.
I just remind everybody that we are using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. Arie, the first one gives me a bit of a chuckle because it's a word I use a lot. You talk about globalization in your book of the American far right. Can you imagine a turn of events in the US that would make the American far right feel even more alienated in their own country and more in common with their foreign counterpart or brethren?
So I think this is one of those interesting paradoxes that we see. So on one hand, these groups are very local in the sense that they are focusing on local patriotism. For example, when you look at their language about foreign policy, they're very critical, for example, about Trump's policies in the Middle East, and they really want to see more isolation and much less in American involvement in foreign conflicts, etc. And also they are using very toxic and a very negative rhetoric against globalization and the adoption of global values or universal values and so on. On the other end, we also see an increased attempt to globalize their struggle, basically present themselves not just as the representatives of a specific American constituency, but also as representatives of a more broad cultural movement of white Christians. So we can see them talking about their brothers in Europe and about collaboration with some European groups, and some of them even travel to other areas of conflict to fight in the name of this kind of what they envision as a Western a Christian cultural identity. So there's always a conflict and some kind of tension between these two tendencies. This is why I talked about globalization. However, it's important to know that if we compare what they're doing to what was done before by left-wing groups in the 70s, by the jihadi groups in the last couple of decades, still the level of global cooperation and the level of global outreach of this group is still fairly limited. Still, most of their members and most of these groups are mainly focusing on domestic issues and promoting what they see as domestic policy objectives. So I know that there's a lot of discourse and there's a lot of chatting about the globalization of many of these groups and so on, but I'm still a bit skeptic about how global they are really. Because again, their leaders can talk a lot about globalizations, but the fact is that we don't see that a lot in their rhetoric.
I guess the second question, Arie, is a good pivot from the first. It's you know, can you talk more about the Proud Boys and their ideology and how they may differ from other more traditional U.S. right-wing groups? I mean, the way I connect these two questions is, you know, there is a Proud Boy affiliation or affiliate or franchise, if that's the word, in Canada and you know, other Western countries. So I'd also like to know, as a kind of second part to this this question, you know, how much, I know they're not homogeneous, these groups, but how much of this interrelationship do you think is going on? I mean, what does it mean to be an affiliate of the Proud Boys in a different country?
I think the Proud Boys are probably the prime example of a group that really combine both male supremacy, anti-feminist rhetoric and ideology with some more traditional white nationalism, white supremacy ideas. So, and they define themselves as a chauvinist organization. So they are mainly focusing on, initially at least, they were focusing on protecting what they describe as the, of the white male, and to end the ongoing, what they say as the ongoing oppression of white males in contemporary society, and so on. And in many ways, it was almost some kind of a backlash to the Me Too movement, if you'd like. And this is why it's interesting to know that it actually was born in one of the most progressive cities in the country, in New York City. And naturally, the Proud Boys, became more of a global phenomenon because they were able to attract a lot of followers also outside of the United States. They do have chapters outside. We don't know how much these chapters are truly active, how much they're truly affiliated to the American Proud Boys. And overall, the numbers are not big. Still, most estimations that I see are talking about maybe a few hundred people in the United States, and much less when we're talking about outside the US. Yes, some of them also travel to fight in some other countries, in Ukraine and Germany, but overall, it's still a very limited phenomenon. And I think that, now that, the president gave them basically a free infomercial in front of 130 million Americans on prime time, probably created more attention and more buzz around the group. And we'll need to see how that eventually influenced their operations. But again, I think this is really one of those examples of this kind of a combination of multiple ideologies and so on.
We have another question here. You've discussed the various types of right-wing groups, such as anti-government, anti-immigration, neo-Nazis. Do you observe any ideological, logistical, or organizational cooperation and alliances between these groups with different motivations?
Not sure which kind of group. We see some collaboration now with some mental groups, but really on the margins, not a lot. There's some elements of this group that are now more, ecofascism ideas and so on. But for the most part, if you're looking for collaboration or overlap and so on, it usually happens within this landscape of life. Some of these groups are more exclusive. That means that they demand their members one group. Some of them are open, and a lot of groups. The fact is that a lot of individuals are basically, rotating between the groups and so on. But there are differences. For example, we're looking at some of the biggest skinheads groups. So many of the skinheads groups actually started to restrict their members' involvement in violent activities, or in general in any kind of outlaw activities. We need to see if that will remain the case or if that will change. But this is why we see much less violence. That in the past were one of the more active violent groups in the country. It's not necessarily means that their level of membership declined. It just means that their leaders are now much less convinced that violent practices are actually beneficial to the group. And despite the fact that they continue to promote a very, white supremacist ideas and
I'm having a little bit of audio problem. I don't know whether it's me or you, Arie, but I'll move on to the next question.
Okay.
Do you think that right-wing groups are mimicking jihadi groups in terms of naming their organizations, whether it be Al-Qaeda, the base, and having global networks? And I guess the second part of that question is, how are the Azov Battalion and Russian Imperial Movement positioned in global networking of right-wing groups. And are right-wing groups in the US linked to these two organizations?
So as I mentioned before, there is some connections. There is some connections, and we know that some of the Rise Above movement members flew, for example, to Ukraine to fight there. So they're basically, we have this unique phenomenon of American foreign fighters that are now fighting for in this kind of non-jihadi conflicts. And in general, I think that we do see connection, we do see collaboration, but again, I think it's important to note that most of the activities, most of the operations are not a product of some kind of a global network. The global network is mainly manifested in sharing ideological ideas, sharing some logistical efforts, engaging in joint activities. It's not necessarily something new. We've seen in the past, for example, American skinheads and European skinheads collaborating in white power rock festivals and other types of events. But when we were talking about the great majority of the violence which is being produced by the American far right, this is mainly produced and focused on domestic issues and with very limited involvement, if any, of foreign groups. It's not really symmetric, right? We mostly see Americans going there to get involved in foreign conflicts. We don't see a lot of influence from the other side. As for the naming, yes. So for example, we are familiar with the base, which is basically translation of Al-Qaeda's name. But most of them, I think, really present themselves as the protectors of white people. And this is something which is related to something that I also talk in my book about the changing rhetoric of the far right. So if in the past they were focusing more on focusing on the need to ensure segregation and to need to ensure ensure the superiority and the privileged status of white people, today they are really utilizing more civil rights rhetoric, basically focusing on the need to, what they see as the need to protect white people, mainly white male, the need to ensure the rights of white people when they are being undermined and so on. So they are really trying to adopt a very civil rights, civil liberties rhetoric and discourse and adapt it to their own objectives and goals.
Excellent. The next one, Arie, is to what extent is the increased targeting of religious groups and institutions reflective of the Protestant Christian identity of the far right historically? Is it kind of a cultural legacy?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that this is related to that legacy, because we haven't seen that before. I think that because many of these groups are interested in improving the effectiveness of their attacks, I think they are much more aware to the importance of maximizing the psychological impact of each one of their attacks, because they have limited resources, because they are not always have the operational capabilities that we find among other groups. It makes sense for them to attack religious sites. That, again, as I mentioned before, helps them to really maximize the psychological and symbolic impact of their attacks, that further ensure that they'll get more visibility and more publicity, and overall also they believe that will generate more impact on the targeted community. I think that's the main reason that we see, and eventually it's also spill over to individuals who perpetrate attacks. So we've seen that in California a couple of years ago. We saw that in the attack against the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh. This kind of tendency is not something that stays within the confine of the more organized group. We also see that among more individuals who operate independently, but also they are gravitating towards attacks against these kind of groups. Also, it's important to remember that the targeting of some specific minority groups, it's maybe very difficult. So, for example, if there's a group of perpetrators who want to target mainly people who are Jewish, right? There's not a lot of options in terms of identify targets that will ensure that they are targeting Jews, except for synagogue, for example.
Excellent, Arie. Again, I think we've fixed the audio issues. The next question is, I'm going to try and combine a couple here. You mention and you write in your book that far-right violence is much more prevalent in diversified areas of the country. And given that there's been, fairly large migration from north to south, for example, we're now talking about Arizona being, in play from a Democratic perspective, mostly due to the new arrivals. So, how does that play out where areas are becoming more progressive? Is there a risk that those areas where people have left will fall back into violence? And what's the impact of, and I think the million-dollar question really is, what's the impact of social media in helping these groups, eliminate geography or create their own, diversity, if you will, online?
So, so as for your first question, I think so. Again, nobody can predict full certainty, but I do think that we'll definitely see more violence in these kind of states that experiencing further diversification. And in general, we'll see, on the national level, we're also seeing an increase in the violence because the US population is being diversifying. And some groups see that as a threat. Some of them even define that as an existential threat. So we'll see that on the national level, but we'll see that on the state level. In terms of the social media, I think that allowed them to increase dramatically their ability to reach out to various populations. It helps many of these groups to really gain a national visibility rather than a local one. But it also, and I think that's the main element, it really provides to many of these groups a strong sense of solidarity and empowerment. One of the things that I show in the book is the importance of empowerment in facilitating violent activities. And when you are a member of one of these groups, and in the offline world, in many cases, you're pretty isolated or you have concerns about expressing your views freely, the online communities provide them a very strong sense of empowerment, a strong sense of legitimacy, and the sense that they are really representing a substantial group of people or a substantial constituency. And having this kind of legitimacy and this kind of sense of empowerment really helps to lower the threshold that prevent, most people from engaging in acts of violence and acts of political violence. So I think that's the main contribution, and this is why it's really important to engage the cyber domain and to try to counter their ability to develop and to breed these kind of online communities. You can also see that in other areas, whether these are in the area of environmental militant groups or forums of incels and male supremacy groups. You see that these groups are really fulfill a social function that allows their members to be more daring and to feel more justified in their cause and more committed to the cause, which are inherently correlated eventually with the tendency to be more violent, more aggressive, more militant, also outside of the online domain.
Excellent. Arie, there's another question about the QAnon movement and how they fit in the realm of all of these other right-wing groups.
So I think QAnon is really, is a movement that really is of an eclectic ideology of many different many different conspiracy theories. It's a really, when I go to their, online forums and so on, you can really see a lot of influence from traditional white supremacy conspiracy theories, as well as more new ones. I think one of the interesting things is that they're really almost exploiting any kind of a social policy problem to integrate that into the into their conspiracy theories, such as their, their fixation on pedophilia, for example, and their fixations on the exploitations of kids and so on. So in many ways, they are really, they created this kind of a framework that allowed them basically to integrate and adopt almost different types of conspiracy theory and add that to their growing this kind of conspiratorial framework or state of mind. There were a few instances when we've seen some members engaging or planning to perpetrate violent attacks and so on. It's still not widespread. It's still not something which we see among the majority of the members, but it's something that we need to be aware of. The fact that this kind of a movement have a good chance eventually to develop also some fringe groups that may try to, to act violently to promote their goals. But I think there's also, more deep social consequences. The fact that they further facilitate erosion in the trust of government, in trust of the political system. They help to erode the trust in the political leadership. All these are long-term effects that eventually can erode the pillars of our democratic system.
Thank you, Arie. It's 11:50. We've, trying to keep this to under an hour. I would like, on behalf of my colleagues at DSG, at GTAC and GMU TRAC, to thank you for being the brave soul that would start this off. We're hoping that we can do many more of these sessions, but we needed somebody who was willing to take the risk as we work through the technology. So I don't know, Louise, if you want to say anything, but I'm very grateful, Arie, for your time, and look forward to hearing more from you and hearing more of your efforts to document domestic terrorism. Thank you.
I just wanted to say that it was just a fabulous talk, and I don't use my words lightly, and I'm going to make sure that I get the book and read it. And I think it really is a very important part of our discussion. Well, it's very important for us in doing this terrorism database to understand how much of our threat is now internal and not external, and to communicate that in statistics that are credible to the larger community. And I think this is going to be very important as we go forward, because our data has not been publicly released, but I imagine next year that it will be. And that it's really important to educate our group who has to provide this official data. And I really think you gave them an important way to think and understand it. And I love the part of explaining the geographic distribution of it, which I think is just a brilliant insight.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your kind words, and it was a real pleasure.
Thank you, everybody, for listening in to the first version of the first episode of the speaker series. Thanks again to you, Arie, and to everybody who helped set this up. Look forward to the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you.